foundation upholding the cause of freedom, which is under attack. And I'm going to talk about here one of the major thrusts of the anti-freedom movement, and how, and perhaps bring together for you a number of things that perhaps you've seen as separate and distinct movements or threats, and show you that they're part of a common theme. There's an underlying theme to this, and if you understand that, it becomes much easier to take them all on, and it becomes much easier to create a united front against all of them. Okay. So what I'm going to talk about, and at the end of the talk, I'll tell you why I put the title "The World Needs More Americans." But we'll get to that. Let's just talk about what's going on now. Okay, this graph here shows that in one graph, perhaps the most important development in human history, and certainly the most important over the past 200 years. And what you're seeing here, okay, this may be hard for you to read, but the scale on the y-axis is GDP per capita, global average GDP per capita in actually 2010 dollars, not that different from current dollars. Okay. And then on the x-axis is global carbon utilization. Gross, not per capita, just total amount of carbon that people have used. All right? And now, so what you can see, here's 1875, okay, in which time the average GDP per capita worldwide in 2010 dollars was about $350. Okay? In 1800, it's about $180. So actually, the 19th century was significant progress. It just doesn't show well on this graph. Okay? But, so it's $180 here. It's about twice that here. Okay? And then here we are in the present, and well, right now, it's a bit over $9,000 per capita. In America, it's $45,000, but global average is $9,000. Okay, which is kind of like Brazil, is actually sort of an average country worldwide. But nevertheless, $9,000 may not seem like that much to people in this room, but historically, it's huge. It's gigantic. It's 50 times what it was in the year 1800 when Malthus wrote his book saying that as population increased, human well-being would decrease because the amount of product cannot go up as fast as population. Okay. Now, but what you're also seeing here is that, I mean, really, this is a linear graph. It is directly proportional to carbon use. Okay? And, don't turn off so much. Okay, now, all right, and most of this is within the lifetime of the people in this room. I mean, here's me, I'm born in 1952. Okay? I can remember Sputnik in 1957. Okay, as an actual event in my own life. All right, 1957, the average GDP per capita in today's dollars is around $2,400 a year. Okay? Today it is 4 times that. Right? Now, the carbon use is 4 times as much too. But, you're saying, gee, 1950s. When I was a kid in the 1950s, my parents would tell me to finish eating my breakfast because there were children hungry in Europe. They're not hungry in Europe anymore. Okay, they're not even that hungry in most places in India and China anymore. Okay, I mean, this is the greatest story ever told. This is humanity's escape from poverty on a global scale. And you would have to say, you know, people say, but, there's a climate catastrophe involved in this. Is there? Okay. I can remember the 1950s. I can remember the weather in the 1950s. For those of you who can't, let me tell you. I'll tell you. You're not that. Okay. The weather in the 1950s was just like the weather now. Okay? That's what it's like. Okay. Now, there may be scientifically measurable changes, but we can argue about that. But clearly, you know, Manhattan's not underwater. In fact, the coastline of Manhattan is the same as it was in 1800. Okay. Can go look. So, you know, in order for someone to say that this on net is a bad thing, okay, they would have to say there was a catastrophe. In other words, not just a minor change at the margins that someone might be able to measure with scientific equipment, but a manifest catastrophe would have to be for someone to argue that on net this is bad. And yet there are, okay? And look, here we are, 2010, here's 1990. Okay, since 1990, world GDP per capita has almost doubled. Mostly China, escaping from poverty, India to some extent, places like this. Okay, transformative thing. They say we should reduce carbon emissions back to here. Okay, how can anyone say such a thing? How can anyone say we should cut the world's standard of living in half? Okay, you know, and yet there are. So what is? Clearly, there's something irrational behind this. There's something irrational behind this, and that's what I'm going to talk about. Okay. So, what I'm going to address is a philosophy which I call anti-humanism. Okay. And it includes the anti-war, you know, the warmist, alarmist stuff, but it includes a lot of other stuff. And what I'm going to show you, or attempt to show you, is that this philosophy has been responsible for most of the human-caused catastrophes of the past 200 years. Now, and that is why any other ideas it comes up with should be immediately suspect. Okay. So what's the idea? Basic concept of anti-humanism is this: that humans are fundamentally vermin consuming the world's fixed resources. Okay. And therefore, human numbers, activities, and liberties must be severely constrained. And therefore, someone must be empowered to do the constraining. And it's that last bit that has always endeared anti-humanist intellectuals to tyrants. And that is why people espousing such ideas will never lack for sponsors. Okay. Now, the first person to espouse it, okay, and I'm talking here about so-called scientific anti-humanism. There are other forms of anti-humanism, but I'm talking about anti-humanism which cloaks itself as being science. Okay? Not religious, not ideological. Okay? The founding prophet of anti-humanism, certainly the best well known, is Thomas Malthus. Now, Malthus said, you know, population grows exponentially. Food supply, which was the product that he considered fundamental, can only grow arithmetically, which is much slower than exponentially, and therefore population will always outrun food production, and therefore there will always be starving people, and that is that. And now, Malthus himself was actually an employee of the British East India Company. That's who paid his salary. And he actually came up with these ideas to justify the horrific oppression that the British East India Company was executing in India, where they were starving people to death by taxing them to death, and rat renting, and that was the justification. And then later on, 1847, it was students of Malthus, and I don't mean just people who read his book. I mean people who actually attended his lectures, were his students, who administered Ireland during the so-called Great Famine, which was, there was no famine in Ireland in 1847. Several million people did die of starvation in Ireland in 1847. But the potato crop did fail. But during the whole time, Ireland was exporting large amounts of grain and beef. Irish didn't starve because there was no food available. The Irish starved because they had no money. Okay? You're talking 1847. You're talking about a world of steamboats and railroads and telegraphs and mass circulation newspapers, in which if you had money, you had food, period. Okay, it's not the Bronze Age. Okay, why do they have no money? Taxation, rack renting, and regulations prohibiting the development of manufactures. Okay? And then India, actually still, once again, administered by Malthus's own students personally, incredible famines caused by these sorts of policies. And Florence Nightingale went to the governor, and she said to him, look, you have to lift these taxes. These people are starving. This looks like Auschwitz, doesn't it? Okay. Okay, this is a real photograph. They had photographs by 1876. Okay, and he said, no, if we lifted the taxes, they would just multiply more, and there would be more of them that are starving. Okay? Now, it gets worse with the advent of Darwin, because Darwin says, look, that's exactly it, but there's a silver lining. Because if there isn't enough to go around, some are going to die, but who are going to die? They are the unfit. And this is how nature progresses, by the unfit being weeded out, by being unable to compete for the limited resources available. Okay? And then it got even worse, because then Darwin's cousin, well, I'll get to that in a minute. But before I do, I just want to just make it clear that Malthusianism is scientifically false, okay? Before I get back to the history. Because some people might think, well, it's an idea that I don't like, but it has to be true. There is only so much to go around, and therefore, if there are more people, there will be less to go around, okay? Now, and of course, many people here may remember one of the most famous Malthusians of our own time, Paul Ehrlich, okay, who wrote a book called The Population Bomb in 1968, which was a runaway bestseller. And he was there saying, here it is, 1968, there's 3.5 billion people in the world, a lot of them are hungry. By the year 2000, it's going to be 7 billion people. And so, you know, they'll be starving in the streets, and not just in India, but right here in America, which is why we have to have a government law limiting population. We should have a Bureau of Population, and you should have to get a permit to have children, and so forth. And a bill was actually introduced in the U.S. Congress to create such a government agency. Fortunately, it failed. Unfortunately, the idea was embraced in China, which we'll get to. Okay, but but look at this. Does this have a?
It doesn't have a laser, no.
It does not. Okay. All right. This is 1968. Okay. The world population is 3.5 billion. The average per capita income was about $3,500. Okay. If Ehrlich's prediction was true, as the population did increase almost as Ehrlich had said. We reached 7 billion people in the year 2010 instead of 2000. But okay, ballpark. If you could predict stocks that good, you'd be as rich as Warren Buffett. But but his prediction is that it would go down standard of living. Instead, it went up. Okay. I mean, you can't be more wrong than this. Now. But see, Ehrlich was not just wrong about the future. Anybody has a right to be wrong about the future. He was wrong about the past. Because Ehrlich was born in 1931, where the population of the world was a little bit more than half of what it was in 1968. And if his theory was correct, that population and well-being are inverse factors, then the world should have been much richer in 1931 than it was in 1968. Okay, and he would have been there to see that rich world of the 1930s. Okay, you know, this is what his thing predicts about the 1930s. And of course, the 1930s were much poorer than the 1960s. Okay, so this is just completely counterfactual. Okay, nevertheless, it is fanatically put forward because this fundamental view of things justifies tyranny. Now, to get back to the history. Francis Galton was Darwin's cousin, and what he said was, okay, yes, survival of the fittest, but why should we leave this to chance? Okay, let's have the government make sure that that is what happens. Okay, let's do this scientifically, because you know, if you leave this to chance, some of the unfit are going to survive. We can't have that. Okay, so he founded a movement which became immensely popular worldwide, and I'm going to talk about it in particular, its outcome mostly in the United States and Germany, to a lesser extent, England. It started in England, spread worldwide. But listen to Galton, listen to this. If we look at the course of nature, one authoritative fact becomes distinctly prominent. Let us make of it what we may. It is that the life of the individual is treated as of absolutely no importance, while the race is treated as everything. Nature being wholly careless of the former, except as a contributor to the maintenance of the evolution of the latter. This is 1873. Right here, you have a preface to the horrors of the 20th century. Right here, you've got National Socialism. Okay, okay, it's right there. So one could go on about Galton, but I won't. So now, these ideas are picked up, as I say, worldwide. One of the places where they're picked up very strongly is Germany. Darwin had a popularizer in Germany named Ernst Happel. Ernst Happel was a real biologist. He made significant contributions to biology. And then Darwin, of course, was a real biologist. I'm not denying their scientific contributions in any sense. Now, I'm talking about the ideological significance of what they put forward. Okay? Except that Haeckel was a much better popularizer than Darwin. The Origin of Species, first edition, 2,000 copies. Any book by Haeckel come out with 400,000 copies in the first run. He was kind of like Carl Sagan, okay? Except in a country where professors are much more prestigious than they are in the United States, and he was like a dean of the German Academy. And then he had numerous followers. And here's one of them, Friedrich Helmholtz, writing in 1875. Okay, and this book is dedicated to Haeckel, actually. He said, just as in nature, the struggle for existence is the moving principle of evolution and perfection, in that the weak are worn away and must make room for the strong, so also in world history, the destruction of weaker nations through the stronger is the postulate of progress. So we're talking about National Social Darwinism. National Socialism, National Social Darwinism. And then here, now it's not just the professors. Here is a member of the real ruling class. General Bernhardi, the chief intellectual of the German General Staff, writing in 1912, okay, science, okay, proves that everywhere the right of the stronger reigns. War is necessary because it eliminates the weak, okay? So, war is necessary. The German militarists embraced this theory of war as a positive good, not war as something that you might have to do in order to achieve geostrategic aims, seize a province here or there, okay? Rather, war itself as a positive good. Winston Churchill read this, okay, at the time, and was horrified. His conclusion, which was the correct conclusion, was that the Kaiser and his people were planning to have a war in order to have a war, okay? And they did. Now, and so you can see here that, how can we put it? Hitler was standing on the shoulders of giants, as it were. He was not that original. He was just taking something that was already there and raising it to a higher level of hysteria. Okay. All right. Now, how about America? Okay. Eugenics movement grew in America, and it was pushed by the progressives. Okay. Eugenics, progressives, and in fact, the Webbs in England, who were the intellectual godfathers of this, making it very clear, eugenics is a great idea, but it can only happen under socialism, because only if you have socialism you have adequate control in order to make sure that the right people breed with the right people, and certain people don't breed, and certain people are taken into account. Okay, but I could read these quotes, but they're all in the book. They're fantastic quotes. But they targeted as their first goal immigration. Okay, and the concept here was that these intellectuals had the right to decide they wouldn't use the word genetics, the blood of the stock, actually, they did use the stock, like breeding term, of the American people, and they would do it by choosing who was going to come here selectively. And so they administered, it was during World War I, everybody drafted was given IQ tests. This was the first mass IQ testing. And these IQ tests were given in English, and they asked questions like, who plays third base for the Detroit Tigers? And you'd be amazed to hear that native-born Americans consistently did much better on these tests than immigrants. And among immigrants, those who had been here for a while did much better than those from the very same country who had been here, who just got here. Okay? So here's what. And then here's a graph that was presented to Congress showing the comparative intelligence of different ethnic groups, okay, because, you know, the Poles had come over more recently than the Germans who had, you know, so forth. This is Henry Fairfield Osborne, who, by the way, was the nephew of J.P. Morgan, and he was the president of the American Museum of Natural History for 30 years. He was Mr. Science from about 1900 to 1930 in the United States. And this is what he's saying about these IQ tests. He says, I believe that those tests were worth what the war cost, World War I, even in human life, if they serve to show clearly to our people the lack of intelligence in our country and the degrees of intelligence of different races who are coming to us in a way which no one can say is the result of prejudice. Okay. We have learned once and for all that the Negro is not like us. So in regard to many races and sub-races of Europe, that we learned that some, we believe, possess an order of intelligence perhaps superior to ours, the Jews, were in fact far inferior. Okay? Henry Fairfield Osborne. By the way, he got the Goethe Medal from Adolf Hitler in 1933. So anyway, they pushed through these immigration laws in the 1920s, which were eugenically directed against Poles, Italians, Jews, Greeks, Slavs in general, which were the more recent waves of immigrants to the United States, to exclude them. And as a result of these laws in particular, Jews were prevented from escaping from Nazi oppression. They were prevented from coming to the United States. These are the Jews on the St. Louis who came to New York in 1939, and you can see they're all very happy they've escaped the Nazis. They were sent right back. Okay, now what about the Nazis themselves? Okay, the Nazis were very clear that, in arguing anyway, that they were not bigots. They were scientists. Rudolf Hess, National Socialism is nothing but applied biology. We have nothing against these people, but we have to get rid of them to make the world a better place. Okay. And Hitler, 1941, the laws of existence prescribes uninterrupted killing so that the better may live. There's only so much to go around. And by the way, that statement was made at the time when he issued the order to the German army to exterminate the population of the city of Leningrad, which is 3 million people. They did not actually succeed in that operation because the Soviets were successful in defending the city, but they killed about half of them. But anyway, and the point is, it is absolutely false. It's a myth that the genocides done by the Nazis were done behind the back of the German people. Okay, most of the genocides were done by the German army, which was drawn from the German people and had direct communication with the German people. And I mean, there were over 10,000 killing centers in the Third Reich. Okay, over 2 million people employed in various kinds of genocidal operations against Jews, against the handicapped, against Slavs, against Gypsies. There was a whole bunch of programs. This was known, and it was popular. Okay, and if you read the memoirs, it's very interesting stuff that's been published. by people who, going into the 1930s, were conservatives, initially horrified by the Nazis and thought they were repugnant, and but then people around them start assimilating these ideas. And then, for instance, this German girl who was at this prep school in Berlin, of upper-class kids, some of whom were Jewish, and originally she stood on principle she'd maintain her friendship with her Jewish friends, but then she gradually came to feel that having sympathy for these people was letting her feelings overrule principle, which is "be hard my heart," okay? That it is necessary to put these people down. And as you get a moral inversion, because people become convinced that despite their human feelings, science dictates that we must do this, okay? Now, okay, Germans lose. And for a while, their ideas are unacceptable in polite society here. And in fact, during the war itself, the eugenics movements here had to go underground. They had to shut up. And those who didn't got arrested. Okay? They were busted by the FBI in 1942 as Nazi subversive sympathizers. Okay? But by 1948, they come out again. And 1948, Fairfield Osborn, the son of Henry Fairfield Osborn, publishes runaway bestseller, Our Plundered Planet. Okay? Reworking the Malthusian ideas along environmentalist lines. Okay? And overpopulation. So now you no longer can say we have to get rid of these people because they're not members of the Nordic race. You say we've got to get rid of these people because there's too many people. Okay? And okay. So you get here the campaign to stop the population explosion, which operated in many ways, one of which was published in full-page ads in the New York Times, Washington Post, and other such newspapers. Okay? And now, by the way, one thing you're going to see in the course of this talk is these people are all over the map politically. Sometimes they come in the costumes of the left, sometimes in the costumes of the right. Whatever works. Okay? You should not be too impressed by the costumes. In this case, in the 50s and 60s, what's the costume to wear if you want to have political influence in the United States? Anti-communism. Okay? Why do we need population control? Because the population explosion in the third world is going to create the cannon fodder for the world communist revolution. So we have to stop the population explosion in the third world. Okay? There you go. And then in the 60s, new scriptures start getting written for the doom cult, and one of them, of course, very most prominent, is Paul Ehrlich and his student, John Holdren, who today is President Obama's science advisor. Okay. But here's Ehrlich writing in 1968. A cancer is an uncontrolled multiplication of cells. The population explosion is an uncontrolled multiplication of people. We must shift our efforts from the treatment to the cutting out of the cancer. The operation will demand many apparently brutal and heartless decisions. The pain may be intense. Be hard, my heart. Okay? And 1967, there's a famine in India. Indira Gandhi comes over to speak to President Johnson, give us some grain. The national security people in Johnson's cabinet said, okay, give her grain, but she's got to side with us in Vietnam. India was neutral. The population explosion people said, no, that can go. We want her to accept population control. Well, that's what we'll ask from her in exchange for the grain. And that is what the Johnson administration decided to do, and we'll see what the consequences of that were in a minute. But now here's Holdren and Ehrlich. This is 1971. This is very interesting. When a population of organism grows in a finite environment, sooner or later it will encounter a resource limit. The phenomenon described by ecologists as reaching the carrying capacity of the environment applies to bacteria on a culture dish, to fruit flies in a jar of agar, and to buffalo on a prairie. It must also apply to man on this finite planet. Okay? In other words, the limits of the planet dictate that ultimately we're just a bunch of fruit flies in a jar of agar, and maybe the scientist in charge can help us survive a little longer by killing half of us at his or her discretion. You know, And of course, they're the ones who do it. We can come back to that quote later. And as I said, that is Holdren and Ehrlich. Now, Club of Rome, 1972, very eminent group. Top-level European aristocrats and financiers, American financiers, John D. Rockefeller III. They come out with a report which was absolutely authoritative because they used a computer, an MIT computer. Okay, and computers, as we know, make infallible predictions. They don't make mistakes. And they predicted that the world would run out of everything by about the year 2000. Because they looked at, the known oil reserves and the rate we're using oil, and it runs out in 1998. And if you look at the known copper reserves and the rate we're using copper, it runs out in 1993. And zinc maybe lasts till the year 2001, but basically we're running out of everything by the year 2000. And no one but some Neanderthal from the Chamber of Commerce could possibly disagree with this profound study. Okay? Now, one man did. His name was Julian Simon. He's an economist, wrote a great book called The Ultimate Resource. He said, this is absolute nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. There aren't fixed resources. Resources are determined by technology. As technology advances, the amount of resources will advance. I'll bet anyone, they can choose 10 of these things. I'll bet him that each of these will be cheaper in real dollars 10 years from now than they are today. And Paul Ehrlich and Holdren took the bet, and they lost the bet on all 10. Okay? Because, once again, resources are not fixed. There's no such thing as natural resources. There's only natural raw materials. It's technology that determines what is and what is not a resource. I mean, before 1998, shale was not a resource. Now it has tripled American oil and gas resources because we have developed the technology to exploit it. Oil itself was not a resource until 1859 when we developed oil drilling. Land was not a resource until we developed agriculture. Okay, so that's the thing. So limited resources. Okay, now what about population control? As a result of the agitation of the Committee to Stop the Population Bomb and similar groups, the U.S. Congress in 1966 passed a law linking U.S. foreign aid to the imposition of population control programs in third world countries. And this was first done in India, as I just mentioned, and then spread to Indonesia and Peru and Africa and all sorts of places with horrific consequences. Now, the way these work, okay, and continue to work, and your tax dollars is continuing to do this to this day, okay, is these programs are top-down dictatorial. National quotas are set from the top, and then the top then sets regional quotas from the various provinces, and the various provincial directors set quotas for the various local teams, how many women have to be sterilized, and so forth. Okay, so it's dishonest. In order to meet quotas, women are lied to, like they're told that a sterilization is reversible. Coercive. Many have been sterilized by brute force at the point of a gun. They're cruel and abusive of dignity and human rights. They are racist. I mean, the whole program is racist in the large. It's the white world trying to prevent the proliferation of darkies. But within the individual countries, they're racist because in every one of these countries, there's always an ethnic group that has a superior social position and there's inferior ethnic groups that they hate. So for instance, in India, it's the high-caste Brahmins sticking into the untouchables. Okay? In Sri Lanka, it's the Sringalese sticking into the Tamils. In Peru, it's the Hispanic people sticking into the Andean people. And in Africa, it's Tribe A doing it to Tribe B that they've always hated. Okay? And they're irresponsible. They regularly have used products that have been banned in the United States and Europe, but they can still sell them to the programs to use like the Galton Shield IUD, which some people may be familiar with, and other such things. All this junk can be used over there with consequences. Now, one place where these ideas have been picked up, which is not imposed by USAID, but simply by the force of the ideas themselves, is China. Okay? 1978, there was a conference in Finland in which Club of Rome made a variety of presentations, and a high-level Chinese bureaucrat went there, picked up the literature, came back here, republished it under his own name, was acclaimed as a genius, and they implemented population control. Okay? Now, the one-child policy. Now, here's the thing about the one-child policy. The one-child policy isn't just, well, the government says everybody's going to have one child, so they all have one child. No. The government says everybody has one child, but in the course of nature, many people will nevertheless have a second child. Okay? What happens then? Okay? Well, if you're out of favor with the local power honcho, that child can be taken away from you, put in a so-called orphanage, and if it's female, it will probably be euthanized in what is known as a dying room. And this is a little girl being left to starve to death in a dying room filled by a British undercover team. If, however, you are a snitch or otherwise make yourself useful to the regime in extra ways, then maybe they'll look the other way. Maybe they'll let you keep the child, although the child will be considered an illegal child and not be allowed to go to public school or various other public benefits. And according to Chinese dissidents, over 100 million baby girls have been killed in this way. Now, of course, it's worse in Africa, as you'd expect, because in Africa, the governments are so weak and the public health infrastructure is so weakly funded that you have population control organizations coming in with USAID money, and they can offer doctors and nurses much higher salaries to work in their clinics than they can work in the local hospital. So they actually destroy the local health infrastructure by hiring away all the talent. Okay? And then, in addition to that, the chosen method that has been used for population control in Africa has been these Norplant needles, which are hypodermics that keep a woman sterile for several months at a time, okay? And these needles end up being reused. Some of them are sold over the counter to women who are illiterate, who are unaware of the germ theory of disease. They end up reusing the needles, either themselves or from others. These needles are worth $1. These people make $1 a day. They're not going to throw them out, okay? And if anybody does throw them out, they'll be taken out of the garbage, dumped by scavengers, and sold. And here is the UN World Health Organization. Okay, but this is not a conservative organization, okay? Saying reuse of syringes and needles in the absence of sterilization exposes millions of people to infection. Syringes and needles are often just rinsed in a pot of tepid water between injections, etc., etc., going on how the AIDS epidemic is being spread in Africa by these programs. Okay? Now, what about fuel? Okay, Club of Rome said we're going to run out of all the fuel within 40 years, but we didn't. Okay? So now, to the extent, though, that fuel production was constrained, U.S., by the way, U.S. Oil production went up at an average rate of 3% a year from 1859 all the way to 1971. Little waivers, but constant trend. It peaked in 1971 and only started growing and went down by a factor of 2 from 9 million barrels a day to 5 million barrels a day by 2006. Starts going up again in 2007 due to the development of shale technology, and now it's about up at 1971 levels. 1971 is when the EPA went into existence. Okay, that's what drove us down. But be that as it may, so this allowed OPEC to drive up the world price of oil catastrophically. I mean, you can look, there's a direct correlation. I mean, this is a graph of oil prices against U.S. unemployment. And here's the shock of 73, here's U.S. unemployment shooting up. Here's 79.80, oil, U.S. unemployment shooting up. Here's 2008, oil goes up to $150 a barrel, U.S. unemployment doubles. And U.S. economy is 25% of the world economy, and an economic shock that can send the U.S. into recession can cause mass starvation in the third world. Okay, you got to realize that. I mean, it's one thing to pay $4 a gallon for gas when you make $45,000 a year. It's another thing when you make $2,000 a year. And so that is. They've campaigned to limit access to energy, and now that this blockade of has been kind of broken, they they are trying to block the practice, i.e. fracking, that makes this blockade to reimpose the blockade. Okay. But I mean, the thing that really grabs me about this is these people who are saying this generally view themselves as people of the left. And they generally, therefore, view themselves as defenders of the weak and the poor. And yet, the policy they are advocating amounts to impose a massive, very regressive tax on America and on the world economy as a whole. And then, of course, well, here you have Obama and Hillary Clinton and the other one, Sanders, saying you have to make sure the oil stays in the ground. Okay? The Club of Rome, their critique of fossil fuels was it was going to run out. Now the problem is that it's not going to run out. Okay? So rather than saying we need to ration the fuel, we have to ration the right to use fuel. That's the conceit. And the conceit is that this is because of global warming. Now, I have to tell you, there has been global warming. You can see that yourself if you read the novels of Charles Dickens. He talks about snowy winters in London. Okay? And there aren't snowy winters in London right now. Okay? So the world absolutely has warmed over the past 150, 200 years, and enough that you can actually see it yourself. But has this resulted in a catastrophe? Has this resulted in anything bad? Well, if you want to know, it's resulted in things that are good. It has lengthened the growing season. It has increased net rainfall worldwide. And the enrichment of CO2 in the atmosphere has accelerated plant growth worldwide. We have photos taken from orbit since 1958, and what they show is the rate of plant growth in the wild has increased by 15%. I'm not talking about agriculture. That's done much better than that, okay, because of fertilizer and crop breeding and science and everything. I'm talking about forests and jungles and grasslands, okay? And we know this is due to CO2 enrichment of the atmosphere because we have repeated the experiments in the lab under controlled conditions many times. Okay, when you lift CO2 from 340 parts per million to 400 parts per million, you increase plant growth. Okay, it's two things plants need to grow. They need water and they need CO2. Water is fairly plentiful. I mean, it's 2% of the atmosphere. CO2 is hundreds of parts per million. It's the limiting ingredient. So this attack is actually, they're saying, you have to stop using CO2 because you're making the world a more fertile planet. In addition to, so you increase plant growth rates 15%, we've increased incomes 400%. You're making the world a more fertile planet. So, you know, what can you say? Chinese saying, where there's a will to convict, evidence is never lacking. And then finally, the other aspect of this global warming thing is the cultic aspect, as opposed to the strictly economic aspect. So here's Al Gore, okay, who sees the global warming crusade as the basis of a unifying ideology of a movement that has the capacity to deliver political power. Okay? He says, the climate change also offers us the chance to experience what very few generations in history have had, the privilege of knowing, gnosis, a generational mission, the exhilaration of a compelling moral purpose, a shared and unifying cause, the thrill of being forced by circumstances to put aside the pettiness and conflict and stifle the restless human need for transcendence. This is religion, okay? The opportunity to rise. When we rise, we will experience an epiphany as we discover this crisis is not really about politics at all. Hello. And then, so to conclude, the fundamental issue here is the nature of humanity. Okay? See, ideas have consequences. If the idea is accepted, that the world's resources are fixed, okay, then each new life is unwelcome. Each unregulated act of thought is a menace. Every person is fundamentally the enemy of every other person, every race of every other race, every nation of every other nation. Okay? And the only outcome of that can be war and genocide. Okay? It's only in a world of unlimited resources can all men be brothers. Okay? So this is why we have to reject anti-humanism and embrace instead an ethic based on human creativity, capacity for invention, okay? And making a statement, okay, we're not living at the end of history, we're living at the beginning of history, okay, that we believe in freedom, not regimentation, progress, not stasis, love rather than hate, okay, in hope rather than despair. And therefore, the fundamental purpose of government must not be to limit human liberty, but to protect it at all costs. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions, so if you just raise your hand and Mr. Zubrin will recognize you.
You mentioned eugenics. I wonder if you could touch on the role Margaret Sanger played in that and her connection to Hillary Clinton.
Well, Margaret Sanger was a eugenicist. Margaret Sanger was very clear in selling population control on the basis that it was a tool to limit the proliferation of inferior races. And that's how it was sold. Margaret Sanger was a participant in the great eugenics conferences of the 20s and 30s, in which Nazism was boosted to international stature. I don't believe that Margaret Sanger personally had a relation to Hillary Clinton. I think Sanger died in the 60s. Hillary was just sort of coming off.
Well, she's expressed admiration.
Oh, yes. Well, yes. Sure. But, yes, the population control movement is an offshoot of the eugenics movement. Population control movement, eugenics, environmentalism, are all offshoots of Malthusianism, as is Nazism. Okay? That's what it is. These are intertwined movements. Yes? Other questions? Sir?
Forgive me if this sounds like a bit of a cheap shot. I'm told by a lot of people on the left, and even some on the libertarian right, that the very notion, seemingly, of the sovereign nation state is something that needs to be gotten rid of, is kind of dangerous, total unlimited flow back and forth. I still believe in the sovereign nation state and the ability to control borders. And yet, if you say that, you are called racist and a horrible human being. Can I have that belief and not be a racist?
Sure. Although, and a sovereign state does have the right to have immigration policies. But then the question is, what should the immigration policy be? Okay? And should it be to keep out all immigrants? Or should it be to invite people of talent? And I'm not talking about just inviting over Elon Musk's. Okay? There are people with all kinds of talents. Okay? There are people who know how to run a drill press real well. Okay? There are people who can pick fruit. There are people who are medical doctors. You should understand, I think most people here in this room understand economics, that anti-immigration policies as such are generally labor protectionist and therefore anti-free enterprise. Okay? Now, there are sometimes reasons to be anti-free enterprise. I don't think the U.S. Army should buy its ammunition from Chinese manufacturers, even if they can make it cheaper. There's a reason there for purchasing from a national vendor. Okay, but free enterprise, in most cases, is a pretty good principle. Okay? And the So, let me get back to the title of the talk. The world needs more Americans. I was at a conference in Moscow in 2013, and I gave a talk with many of the ideas in this talk. Okay, it was a conference on world event. But then the speaker after me got up, and this was a Russian professor from Moscow State University, which is the center of the school of Alexander Dugin, leading anti-American, anti-freedom philosopher in Russia. And this was an associate of his. And he got up and said, "You're wrong. The world does have limited resources, and America is using them up more than anybody else. You're 4% of the world's population, using up 25% of the world's oil, using up this, using up that. He even said we're using up the world's oxygen supply." Okay. And I got up and I answered. I said, "You really, you think you're worse off because of America? Okay. If it wasn't for America, you wouldn't have these, okay, or these, or these, or those." Those are the things I pointed to. Okay, yes, we're 4% of the world's population. We're making 50% of the world's inventions. Okay, and I'm an inventor myself. And by the way, the Shrek firm is my patent lawyers. Okay, I like that. In Denver, Paul Prendergast, you may know him. And I'm very proud of my inventions and being part of, America's, force of inventors, which is world historic in its accomplishments. And yet, we and the rest of the world is greatly benefited by our activity. Okay? But we, in fact, would be better off if the rest of the world was behaving as we are. Okay? If the rest of the world were doing their share, okay, there would be 25 times as much invention going on in the world as there is. Okay? The rate of human progress would be so much faster. Okay? And when I say the world needs more Americans, we could probably use some more here. Okay? This guy wanted there to be less Americans. He hated America. He wanted there to be no Americans. Okay? But also, I would like, we'd all be a lot richer if other countries had laws and practices and a way of life that allowed them to contribute to invention, which includes freedom, property rights, and yes, education, and so forth. We won't be worse off if China was like America and the sons and daughters of Chinese peasants got to go to university and became scientists and engineers, and we'd be vastly better off. Okay, just as they are so much better off because we're here.
One more question, if there is one. Asher?
Yeah, we talk about free enterprise, and the Rio Grande Foundation is a free market institute. I wanted to hear a free market response to these people about population control. I would say that the free market can handle any sort of population control, not necessarily a government. In other words, if food is too expensive, people will have less children. Something along those lines. What do you think?
Well, I think if food is expensive, more people will go into making food.
Or that, yeah.
Okay, and that is, or making inventions that will make food cheaper, which is actually what happened. And producing technology that produces more food. And look, the population of the world did double since Ehrlich's book came out. The food supply quadrupled. Okay, do you know that in China right now, this is hard to believe, but this is a fact, people are eating more meat per capita than Americans. Okay? Used to be Americans were the only people that ate substantial amounts of meat. Okay, no one else could afford it. Then, as people get out of desperate poverty, well, the first thing, they move from cereals to vegetables and fruits, and then they get to meat, okay? And then, they get to organic food. Wow. One of the first things that poor people want to be able to get their hands on once they're able to afford it is meat. And there's many advantages to that. once again, there's many people from my generation in this room. 1950s, you could distinguish white Americans from Europeans just by looking at their teeth. Just by looking at their teeth, you know immediately.
All right. Thank you very much.
All right. Anyway, get the book, and if they run out, I've got some more copies with me as well.
Dowd will be out front handling those sales. Well, we'll eventually be able to do credit card once I get my cell phone set up. So thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next time.